The contractions were 3 minutes apart. Rose knew because she'd been counting, gripping the kitchen counter, breathing through each wave, watching the clock on the microwave. 3 minutes, then 2.5. She needed to go to the hospital, right now. That's when her mother-in-law walked into the kitchen, took one look at her, and said the words that would echo through the rest of their lives. "Get out of my house." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Let me call my son." Not, "I'll get the car." Just, "Get out." Rose was 9 months pregnant. Her water had broken 20 minutes ago. The floor was still wet beneath her feet. And the woman who was supposed to be family picked up Rose's overnight bag, the one she packed 2 weeks ago just in case, and threw it out the front door onto the porch. Then she pointed. Rose walked out into the cold. The door slammed behind her. The lock clicked. She stood on that porch alone, in the dark, in labor, with nowhere to go and no one coming. What happened in the next 6 hours would change everything, not just for Rose, not just for the baby, but for the woman who locked that door and believed with complete confidence that she had won. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless.
Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video, share, and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Is it United States, London, maybe Canada, Jamaica, South Africa, or anywhere? We want to know.
The house on Maple Drive was beautiful from the outside. 3 stories, white shutters, a garden that the neighbors always complimented. Visitors who came for dinner left saying, "What a lovely home, what a warm family, what a lucky young couple to live in such a place." They didn't stay long enough to see what happened after the door closed. Margaret Collins had lived in that house for 31 years. She'd raised her son, Isaac, in its rooms. She'd buried her husband in the church 2 blocks away and come home to its empty hallways every night for the past 8 years. Filling the silence with television and routines and the slow, careful maintenance of a life that looked whole from the outside. Margaret was 63 years old. She was sharp. She was organized. She could quote scripture on Sunday and cut you down to size on Monday. She had strong opinions about everything: the right way to fold towels, the correct temperature for serving soup, the kind of woman her son should have married. Rose was not that woman. Rose was 26, the daughter of a school teacher and a man who fixed cars. She'd grown up in a small apartment across town, gone to community college, worked 2 jobs to finish her degree in nursing. She had a gap in her front teeth, and she laughed too loudly, and she wore her hair natural because she didn't see any reason to change it. And from the very first night Isaac brought her home for dinner, Margaret had decided, this girl was not good enough. She never said it directly. Margaret was too smart for direct. She said it in the way she looked at Rose's shoes when she walked through the door. She said it in the tiny hesitations before she answered Rose's questions, as if deciding whether Rose deserved a real answer or just a polite one. She said it in how she spoke about Isaac's ex-girlfriend, Claire, in soft, nostalgic tones whenever Rose was within earshot. Claire had been to university. Claire's father was a doctor. Claire always brought flowers when she visited. Isaac didn't see any of it. That was the thing about Isaac. He was a good man. Rose believed that, had to believe that because she loved him. But he had grown up in this house, shaped by this woman, trained from childhood to see Margaret's cruelty as love, her control as care, her sharpness as simply the way things were. When Rose told him early on that Margaret made her uncomfortable, Isaac got quiet. "She just needs time," he said. "She lost my father. She's lonely. Just give her a chance." So Rose gave her a chance, and then another. And then she stopped mentioning it because every time she did, she saw something flicker in Isaac's eyes. Not disbelief exactly, but a kind of exhausted resistance, like a man who couldn't bear to look at something painful and had decided the easiest thing was to look away. They got married in the spring, a small ceremony at the church 2 blocks from Margaret's house. Rose's mother cried. Isaac's mother smiled for photographs, and that night at the reception told Rose's cousin that the dress was lovely, but perhaps a different cut would have been more flattering. 6 months later, Rose was pregnant. Isaac was overjoyed. He held her hands in the kitchen and spun her around and said, "We're going to be a family." And his face was so open and happy that Rose cried, not from sadness, but from the complicated mix of joy and dread that had become familiar to her. Because she knew what was coming. What came was Margaret arriving at their apartment 2 days after the positive test, already full of plans. The baby would need to be christened at her church. The nursery colors should be neutral, yellow or green, not that garish purple Rose had mentioned. And of course, since Isaac traveled so much for work, it made more sense for Rose to move in with Margaret during the pregnancy. So she wouldn't be alone, so there would be someone to help. Rose had looked at her husband across the kitchen table. Isaac had looked at his soup. That was how Rose ended up living in the house on Maple Drive. The first month, Margaret was almost kind. She cooked large dinners and set a place for Rose at the table, and asked about the prenatal appointments in a voice that sounded like concern. Rose told herself to be grateful. The second month, the instructions began. Don't eat that, it causes gas. Sleep on your left side, not your right. Don't call your mother so often. It's not good for the baby to be around that kind of noise. Don't wear those shoes. Don't use that shampoo. Don't laugh so loud when you're on the phone. I'm trying to watch my program. Rose followed the instructions. She rearranged her habits around Margaret's preferences, like moving furniture in a room that didn't belong to her. By the third month, the instructions had become corrections. You made the bed wrong. You left a ring on the counter. You forgot to take your vitamins. I checked the bottle. You told Isaac about the doctor's appointment before you told me. I'm in this house, Rose. I should be the first to know everything that happens here. Rose started calling Isaac every evening, not because she wanted to worry him, but because she needed to hear a voice that wasn't sharpened against her. He's coming home this weekend, she told herself. When he's here, it's different. When he's here, she's different. And it was true. When Isaac came home on weekends, Margaret transformed. The warm version appeared, the laughing version, the one who made Isaac's favorite meals and asked Rose gentle questions about the pregnancy, and held Rose's hands and said, "I'm so glad you're here. This house needed life in it." Rose wanted to say something. Every weekend, she came close. But what would she say? Your mother is 2 different people, and I only ever see the dangerous one? Your mother has never hit me, never screamed at me, never done anything that would look like abuse if I described it out loud? She has only made me feel every single day like I have a guest who has overstayed her welcome in my own marriage. She said nothing. Instead, she got larger and slower and more dependent on the house she wasn't allowed to feel at home in, and Margaret's instructions multiplied, and Rose counted the weeks until the baby came and she could go back to the apartment and close the door. The 8th month was when things shifted. Isaac got a contract overseas. 8 weeks, he said, maybe 10. Big opportunity. And he looked at Rose with those eyes, the apologetic ones, the ones that said, "Please don't make this hard." And Rose nodded and said, "Of course, go. We'll be fine. We'll be fine." She believed it when she said it, but something changed in Margaret after Isaac left, as if his absence removed the last restraint, as if for months she had been performing the reasonable version of herself and the performance had exhausted her, and now finally she could stop. The first week after Isaac left, Margaret reorganized the nursery Rose had spent 3 weekends setting up. "I moved some things," Margaret announced over breakfast. "It wasn't practical." The second week, she told Rose to call her own mother less. "I can hear you in there every night on that phone. You're disturbing my sleep. And a baby doesn't need a mother who clings to her own mother that way. It's not healthy." Rose looked at her across the breakfast table. Margaret looked back calm and pleasant, as if she had said something perfectly reasonable. The third week, she took Rose's pee. "There's only one spare, and I need it. For emergencies. You're here all the time anyway. What do you need a key for?" And Rose,
8 months pregnant, exhausted and far from her husband, and further from herself than she had ever been, handed the key over. She didn't tell Isaac. She didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound like an accusation, and she was so tired of navigating the space between his love for her mother and his love for her, so tired of being the one who made things complicated. She would have the baby, she would go home. 14 days. That's all she had to wait.
It started at 11:43 at night. Rose woke with a pain so deep and specific that she knew immediately this was different. This wasn't the practice contractions she'd been having for 2 weeks. This was real and serious, and this was beginning. She sat up in bed. The pain came again. She breathed through it the way the hospital class had taught her, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Then she felt the wetness. She turned on the bedside lamp with shaking hands and looked at the sheets and understood. Her water had broken. For a moment, just one moment, she sat in the yellow lamplight and felt something that was almost peace. This was it. This was the moment. Soon there would be a baby. Soon this long, lonely, difficult chapter would end and something new would begin. She picked up her phone and called Isaac. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. The time difference. He was sleeping. She texted, "Water broke. Going to hospital. Don't worry, I'm okay. Call me when you wake up. I love you." Then she stood up slowly, careful of her body, and walked down the hall to Margaret's room. She knocked. "Margaret?" she called through the door. "Margaret, I need to go to the hospital. The baby's coming." Silence. She knocked again. "Margaret, I'm sorry to wake you, but I need help. I need a ride or I need to call someone, please." A long pause, then the sound of movement, then the door opened. Margaret stood in her robe, her hair in its nighttime scarf, her face carrying that expression Rose had seen so many times, the one that said, "You are an interruption." "What time is it?" It wasn't a question. "Almost midnight. My water broke. The contractions are—" Margaret looked at her. The look was long and measuring. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, and Rose followed, relieved, thinking help was coming. In the kitchen, Margaret filled a glass of water and stood at the counter and said, without turning around, "I've been meaning to say something to you for a while now." Rose stood in the doorway, another contraction building. "Margaret, the hospital." "I know what you've been doing," Margaret said, "all these months, running to Isaac with your complaints, trying to turn my own son against me. I see how you look at me. I know what you think of me." The contraction peaked. Rose gripped the doorframe. "Please," she said when it passed, "please, we can talk about this later. I need to get to the hospital right now." Margaret turned around, and the expression on her face was something Rose had never seen there before, something unveiled, something that had always been beneath the politeness and the corrections and the passive, patient cruelty. Pure, clean dislike. "I am not driving you anywhere tonight," Margaret said. "Call a taxi, call your mother, call whoever you like, but I am not going to be guilted into being your servant just because you decided to go into labor in the middle of the night in my house." Rose stared at her. Then Margaret set down her water glass. Then she walked to the closet near the front door, opened it, and pulled out the overnight bag Rose had packed 2 weeks ago. She carried it to the front door. She opened the front door. Cold air rushed in. She set the bag on the porch and pointed. The gesture was so calm, so final, like setting out the trash. "You can't be serious," Rose whispered. Another contraction, this one harder. She was 2.5 minutes apart now. She knew from her training what that meant. She knew from the clinical, objective nursing school part of her brain that she needed to be in a hospital, that this was progressing quickly, that things could become complicated very fast. "Get out of my house," Margaret said. Rose stood in the kitchen doorway, in labor, and understood this woman who was supposed to be her family, and understood with terrible clarity that there was nothing left to hope for here. She walked to the door. She picked up her bag. She went outside. The door closed behind her. The lock clicked, a small, precise sound in the silent night. Rose stood on the porch in the dark and the cold, and another contraction tore through her, and she bent over the porch railing and breathed and breathed and breathed. Then she picked up her phone. She called her mother first. The phone rang twice. Her mother's voice came through groggy and immediately alarmed. "Rose, what's wrong?" "The baby's coming," Rose said. "Margaret threw me out. I'm on the porch. I need you." Her mother said 2 words. "I'm coming." Then Rose called 911 because she was a nurse and she knew her body and she knew something her mother didn't know yet. She might not have time to wait. The dispatcher was calm. She told Rose to stay on the line. She asked the contractions, and Rose told her, and there was a brief, professional pause that said everything. An ambulance was already being dispatched. "Stay on the line. Don't hang up." Rose sat down on the porch steps, her overnight bag beside her, the phone pressed to her ear, and labored alone in the dark while the dispatcher talked her through it. Inside the house, the lights stayed off. She could see the glow of the television through the downstairs window. Margaret had turned it on. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. 9 minutes that felt like 9 years. The paramedics came up the walk quickly, and when they saw her, on the steps, breathing hard, alone, something shifted in their faces. Not pity exactly, more like a kind of quiet rage that professional people learn to keep under the surface. "You're going to be okay," the woman paramedic said. "You did the right thing calling us. Let's get you up." As they helped her to the stretcher, Rose heard the front door open. She turned. Margaret stood in the doorway. She'd turned on the porch light now. She was watching the paramedics, watching Rose on the stretcher, and her face had changed again. Something was moving behind her eyes. Calculation, maybe, or something closer to the first small seed of fear. "Is she all right?" Margaret called out to the paramedics, her voice pitched perfectly. The concerned mother-in-law, the worried woman who had simply been inside when this happened. The male paramedic glanced up at her. Then he looked back at Rose, a question in his face. Rose looked at the porch, at the door that had been locked, at the overnight bag she'd dragged down the steps herself. "She's been outside this whole time," Rose said. "Alone." The paramedic looked at Margaret. His expression did not change, but something in it became very still. He turned back to Rose. "Let's go," he said. They loaded her in, the doors closed, the ambulance pulled away. Rose didn't look back. Rose's mother arrived at the hospital 12 minutes after the ambulance. Her name was Vivian, and she was 54 years old, and she had worked 22 years as a school teacher, and she had a way of walking into a room that made it immediately clear to everyone in the room that she was the most important person in it. Not because she demanded attention, because she was simply, completely, and without apology, present. She walked into the maternity ward still in her house clothes, her coat thrown over them, and when she found Rose, pale and gripping the bed rails, 2 nurses already at her side, she crossed the room in 5 steps and took her daughter's face in her hands. "I'm here," she said. "Mama's here." Rose burst into tears. The labor was fast and hard. No time for an epidural. The anesthesiologist was called, but the baby had its own timeline and was not interested in waiting. Rose's mother held one hand and a nurse held the other, and Rose bore down and breathed and bore down again, and at 4:27 in the morning, the baby came. The cry was immediate, loud, indignant, furious at the cold air, at the bright lights, at the world in general. A girl. The nurse placed her on Rose's chest, still crying, still announcing herself to the room. Rose looked down at this small, outraged, perfect person and said, in a voice wrecked with exhaustion and love, "Hello." The baby stopped crying. Just like that, like she recognized the voice, like she had been listening to it for 9 months and this was the one she'd been waiting for. Rose's mother was weeping openly. The nurses were pretending not to notice their own eyes filling. The room was full of a silence that felt earned and sacred. Rose held her daughter and thought, I would go through every single moment of the past 9 months again, every correction and cruelty and cold look across every breakfast table if it ended here, in this, with you. She named her Clara. Clara Rose Collins. At 6 in the morning, 2 hours after Clara was born, Margaret Collins arrived at the hospital. She had dressed carefully. She wore her good coat and her pearl earrings, and she carried a gift bag with a yellow ribbon. She spoke to the woman at the front desk in her pleasant, measured voice and asked for Rose's room number and was told visiting hours didn't start until 9. She waited. She sat in the waiting area for 3 hours, the gift bag on her lap, and when 9 o'clock came, she walked down the corridor to Rose's room and knocked on the door. Vivian opened it. The two women looked at each other for a moment. They had met twice before, at the wedding and at Christmas, and had been polite to each other in the way of women who understand each other completely and have chosen not to say so. "I'd like to see my grandchild," Margaret said. Vivian's face was unreadable. She opened the door wider and stepped back. Rose was sitting up in bed. Clara was in her arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket, asleep. Rose looked up when Margaret walked in, and her face did not change. It became very calm and very still, the way a lake becomes still before a storm. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, approaching the bed. She extended a hand toward the baby. "May I—" Rose moved Clara slightly, a small adjustment, nothing dramatic, but Margaret's hand found no child beneath it. She looked at Rose. Rose looked back at her, calm, still. "You locked me out," Rose said. Her voice was quiet, not angry, just factual. Margaret opened her mouth. "Rose, I was frightened. I wasn't thinking clearly. I know that wasn't the right—" "You locked me out in labor," Rose said, in the same quiet voice. "I sat on the porch alone for 9 minutes. I labored on your front steps, and you watched me from inside with the television on. I was going to call a taxi for you. I just needed—" Vivian, who had been standing by the door, made a sound. It wasn't a word, but it stopped Margaret mid-sentence as effectively as any word could. "I would like you to leave," Rose said. "Please." Margaret drew herself up. Her voice took on that familiar quality, the one that said, "I am the adult here," the one that had worked on Rose for 9 months because Rose had been alone and tired and far from home. "Rose, I understand you're emotional right now. You've just given birth, but I am this baby's grandmother, and I have a right to—" "You have no rights here," Vivian said from the doorway. Her voice was very calm, the kind of calm that is the opposite of uncertain. Margaret turned to look at her. "This is my daughter," Vivian said. "That is my granddaughter. You put my daughter outside in the cold, in labor, in the middle of the night, and locked the door. She gave birth in an ambulance. Did you know that? She delivered almost in that ambulance because of what you did." Margaret's face changed, the first real flicker of something. "I didn't know it would happen that—" A nurse appeared in the doorway. She had been at the desk when Margaret arrived. She had overheard enough of the corridor conversation to understand what was happening. "Ma'am," the nurse said, "the patient has asked you to leave." Margaret stood very still. The gift bag was still in her hand, the yellow ribbon bright and cheerful. She looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, then looked at Rose, then at the baby, this small sleeping child who had no idea yet what world she'd been born into. Something crossed Margaret's face. It was complex and fast, and Rose almost missed it. Almost. Then Margaret turned and walked out the door.
Isaac landed at 7 in the morning, unaware. He had been on a 12-hour flight, his phone off, and when he turned it on in baggage claim, his screen filled with messages, from Rose first, then from his mother, then from Rose's mother, then from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be the paramedic who had treated Rose and taken it upon himself to call. Isaac stood in baggage claim at the airport and read his messages, and his face went through expressions that people moving around him would later, separately, each describe as like watching someone age 10 years in 2 minutes. He didn't wait for his bag. He left it on the carousel and ran.
He arrived at the hospital still in his travel clothes, unshaven and hollow-eyed, and when he pushed open the door to Rose's room, she was nursing Clara, and she looked up and he saw what was in her eyes. Not anger, not accusation, just an exhaustion so deep it looked like distance. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the baby, and said, "I'm sorry," in a voice so broken it was barely a voice at all. Rose looked at him. "You knew she was like this," she said, not an accusation, just the truth, laid out between them, waiting to be acknowledged. Isaac's jaw worked. He stared at his wife and his newborn daughter and the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and his own failures, and he said the only honest thing he could find. "I knew," he said. "I told myself it wasn't that bad. I told myself if I ignored it, it would work itself out. I put the easy thing above the right thing, and you paid for it." He pressed his forehead against her hand. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Rose." Rose looked down at Clara, who had finished nursing and was looking up at the ceiling with the serious, concentrated expression of someone working out a complicated problem. "She has your nose," Rose said. Isaac let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. Margaret answered on the second ring. She was home. She had been home since the hospital, and the house had never felt so large or so quiet. She had unpacked the gift bag. She had made tea. She had sat at the kitchen table and looked at the chair where Rose had sat every morning for 9 months, and she had thought, with a discomfort she did not yet have the vocabulary to call guilt, "What have I done?" Isaac's voice, when it came through the phone, was the voice she had never heard from him before. Not her Isaac, the one she'd shaped and shielded, the one who called her every Sunday and deferred to her judgment and never pushed back on her versions of things. This voice was different, flat, certain. "Mom," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. Everything. I was going to call. Tell me, Mom, from the beginning." So she told him. And as she heard herself speak, heard herself explain that she was tired, that Rose had woken her up, that she had simply needed Rose to take some initiative instead of depending on everyone around her, she heard, perhaps for the first time, how it sounded from the outside. She stopped speaking. Isaac was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled in the specific way that means a person is choosing their words with great care because the alternative is to say something that cannot be taken back. "She almost gave birth on your front steps," he said, "because you locked the door, because you couldn't drive her 12 minutes to the hospital." "Isaac!" "She's a nurse, Mom. She knows labor. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't exaggerating. And even if she had been, even if it had been false labor, even if there had been no emergency at all, you don't put your pregnant daughter-in-law outside at midnight. You don't do that." Margaret said nothing. "I have spent 3 years watching you treat my wife like she doesn't belong. I told myself it wasn't what I thought it was. I chose my comfort over her dignity, and I have to live with that. But I will not let my daughter grow up watching her father do the same thing his mother did. Do you understand me?" The silence stretched. "You're not welcome at the hospital right now," Isaac said. "I need you to give Rose time. I need you to think about whether you can actually change, Mom, not perform change, not apologize and then go back to being who you've been. Actually change. Because if you can't," he stopped, "then there's nothing else to say." He hung up. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the house on Maple Drive for a very long time. Outside, the garden the neighbors always complimented caught the early morning light and looked exactly the same as it always had. But inside, something had shifted in the architecture of things, something load-bearing, something that once moved could not simply be moved back. Clara Collins was 6 days old when her grandmother came back. Not Margaret. Vivian. Vivian came every day. She brought food in containers she'd cooked herself and left at the door without expectation of being invited in, until Rose started inviting her in, and then she'd sit in the chair by the window and hold Clara while Rose slept, singing songs Rose remembered from childhood. Low songs, half in a language Rose had never learned but knew in her bones. Isaac took 2 weeks' leave. He cooked badly but enthusiastically, burning things and making Rose laugh, and he changed diapers at 3 in the morning without being asked, and sometimes Rose would wake in the night to find him sitting in the nursing chair, just holding Clara, not doing anything, just being there with her in the dark. Those nights, Rose would watch him from the bed and think, "This is who you can be. Don't let that go." The conversation about Margaret was long and not always gentle. There were nights when the exhaustion and the accumulated weight of 9 months stripped the politeness from Rose's voice, and she said things that needed to be said, and it hurt them both, and they had to sit with that hurting and not run from it. Isaac learned things about his own childhood he had always half known and never named. He cried about them once in the kitchen with his back to Rose, and she went to him and put her arms around him from behind, and they stood like that for a long time. He understood, finally, what it had cost Rose to stay silent, what it had cost her to protect his feelings about his mother, what it had cost her to carry both his blindness and Margaret's cruelty alone in that house while he was away convincing himself that everything was fine. He understood that love without attention is just intention, and he chose to do better. 3 weeks after Clara was born, Margaret drove to Rose's apartment. She had called Isaac first to ask if it was allowed. Isaac had said, "Call Rose." So she had called Rose. The phone had rung 4 times. Rose picked up. Margaret had prepared a speech, a careful, measured speech that acknowledged her faults while not quite owning them, that expressed regret in the way of someone who regrets the consequences more than the actions. But when she heard Rose's voice, tired and careful, something happened. The speech dissolved. What came out instead was raw and formless and barely a sentence. "I don't know how to fix this," Margaret said. "I don't even know how to begin." Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Come over on Saturday, 11 o'clock. We'll have lunch." Saturday came. Margaret arrived at 11 exactly. She rang the bell and waited, and the door opened, and it was Isaac who opened it. And he looked at her for a moment, really looked at her. Not the way a son looks at his mother, but the way a man looks at someone who has harmed his family and is deciding what to do with that knowledge. Then he stepped back and let her in. The apartment was warm. It smelled like food. Vivian was in the kitchen, and she looked up when Margaret entered, and they exchanged a look that contained everything they would never say to each other. Rose was on the couch with Clara. Margaret walked toward them slowly. Her hands were empty this time. No gift bag, no pearl earrings, just herself. She stopped at the edge of the couch and looked down at her granddaughter. Clara was 3 weeks old. She was awake, doing the thing she did where she seemed to be studying the ceiling as if it contained information she was trying to decode. She had Rose's gap-toothed mouth already somehow, even without teeth. She had Isaac's forehead. She was, undeniably, completely herself. Margaret sat down in the chair across from the couch. And then something happened that no one planned and no one could have anticipated. Clara turned her head, not toward her mother, not toward the sound of voices. She turned her head in the specific direction of Margaret's chair, and she looked directly at the older woman with those unfocused newborn eyes that see light and shape but not yet detail, and she made a sound, not a cry, something softer, something that was unmistakably curiosity. Margaret's face did something Rose had never seen it do. It opened, like a window in a room that had been shut for years. The woman who had made cutting remarks about Rose's shoes and monitored her phone calls and stood in a kitchen at midnight pointing at a door, that woman seemed to recede, and what was left in the chair was older and smaller and something that looked startlingly like loneliness. "Can I?" Margaret started. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. Then she stood up carefully and carried her daughter across the room and placed her in Margaret's arms. Margaret held the baby with the practiced ease of a woman who had held one before, decades ago, and her hands were steady, but everything above her shoulders was not. Her chin trembled, her eyes flooded. "Hello," she whispered to Clara. Clara looked at her with that serious, concentrated expression. Then she closed her eyes. Margaret sat there holding her granddaughter and wept. Not silently, not politely, but messily and without restraint, the kind of crying that means something is actually changing, not just regretting. Rose sat back down on the couch and watched. Isaac sat beside her and took her hand. Vivian, from the kitchen doorway, watched Margaret cry, and after a long time she turned back to the stove without speaking, because she was Vivian, and she did not need to say anything. She had raised a daughter who could make her own judgments. She trusted that. Nothing was fixed that Saturday. That's the truth of it, and it's important to say. One afternoon did not undo 9 months of what Rose had endured, did not erase the night on the porch, did not mend the distance that had grown in her marriage while she suffered silently, and Isaac chose comfort over truth. Healing was slow and imperfect. Margaret made mistakes, slipped back into old patterns, caught herself, tried again. There were weeks when Rose kept her distance, and that was her right, and Isaac supported it without question. There were conversations that were hard and didn't resolve cleanly and had to be left open and returned to. But Margaret came every other Saturday. She held Clara and brought food that, it turned out, she'd been cooking since Rose moved in, food she had always judged and was now realizing she had used judgment as armor against affection. One afternoon, 6 weeks into these visits, Margaret said to Rose, without preamble, while Clara was asleep between them on the couch, "I was terrified of you." Rose looked at her. "You were so certain," Margaret said, "about who you were. You never seemed to need approval the way I thought a woman should need it. I didn't understand it, so I decided it must mean something was wrong with you." She paused. "There was nothing wrong with you." Rose sat with this for a moment. "There was nothing right about what you did to me either," she said. Margaret nodded. No, there wasn't. They sat in silence for a while. Clara slept between them, her small chest rising and falling, completely untroubled. Rose said, "I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. I'm not asking you to." "Then they can know each other," Rose said, meaning Margaret and Clara. "As long as you treat her the way you should have treated me. I need you to understand the difference." Margaret looked at her granddaughter, the small, perfect face, the gap-toothed mouth that was somehow already visible. She looked at her for a long time. "I understand the difference," she said. Rose believed her, not completely, not yet, but enough to begin. Clara Collins turned 1 year old in the spring. The birthday party was at Vivian's house, small, loud, full of food and people who loved Rose and Isaac and the little girl who had announced herself to the world at 4:27 in the morning and hadn't stopped announcing herself since. Margaret came. She sat beside Vivian at the kitchen table. 2 grandmothers who had been on opposite sides of something and were now carefully navigating a shared table. They didn't become friends that afternoon. Maybe they never would. But they passed dishes to each other and agreed that Clara had far too much energy for one person, and that Isaac should have been warned before he tried to feed her birthday cake. When Clara, frosting-covered and triumphant, toddled across the room toward the corner where Margaret sat, Margaret bent down and opened her arms. Clara walked straight into them, like she had always known they were there, like it was simply, "Yes, this person. I choose this person." Margaret held her granddaughter and looked up across the room and found Rose watching. Rose didn't smile exactly, but she nodded, the smallest nod, the kind that means, yes, this is allowed. You have earned this much. Margaret held the baby tighter. Outside, the spring was doing what spring does after a long winter. Everything that had seemed dead, proving it had only been waiting. Some women are the kind of mother-in-law who becomes a second mother. Some were the kind who become the hardest lesson their children's spouses will ever learn. And some, not many, but some, are the kind who hold a baby in their arms for the first time and feel themselves cracked open, and choose in that cracked open place to become different. Margaret Collins was the third kind. Not because she deserved to be, not because she had earned it, but because a child looked at her without any record of who she had been, without any history of locked doors and cold kitchens and pointing fingers. Just, hello, I see you. I don't know yet what you are to me. Show me. And Margaret, for the first time in longer than she could name, chose to show her something worth seeing. The first cry changed everything. Not because it was magic, because it made real what had only been abstract, because it turned a battle about pride and territory and fear into something undeniable. Here is a person, a new person, and everything you do next she will absorb and carry forward. What will you give her to carry? That's the question Clara asked, without words, in every room she entered, and the people who loved her had to decide every single day how to answer. What would you have done if you were Rose, alone on that porch? Would you have given Margaret a second chance? Let us know in the comments. Kindly like, share, and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and your thoughts. Which part got to you the most? Thank you, and see you in the next video.